What's up, guys, and welcome to the Photo Finish, Scot Radio's home for motorsports in general and NASCAR in particular. I'm your host, Ben Schneider, and it has been over a month since our show's been on the air. It's been a little while, so we have a lot to get to catch up. But first, I just want to explain briefly kind of where we've been and hopefully where we're going to be going forward. So our show was Tuesday nights last semester, and Matt and I, who's my usual co-host, both have a class that we're taking Tuesday nights from 6 to 9, so we were going to have to find a new time slot for this semester, and we ended up finding Monday nights at 9 o'clock, which is where our first three shows this year have been. But Matt had a schedule conflict come up that was going to make it very difficult for him to even so much as make one or two episodes of the show this year. And ironically, of course, Matt couldn't even be here tonight. He had something else come up as well. But Thursday nights at 10 is hopefully going to give him the freedom to come on and join us at least every other week or so, so that I don't have to keep coming in and doing the show by myself. But with a combination of trying to get the time slot change made official and also spring break being last week at Gordon, it's been a while. So we have a lot to get to and a lot to cover to catch up. And the biggest news coming out of the NASCAR world, certainly if you've been following along, has to be Kyle Busch, mania Kyle Busch all the time. Kyle Busch getting 200 combined wins in NASCAR's top three series. Now, Busch actually signed a contract extension shortly after we had our most recent episode with Joe Gibbs Racing. It's a multi-year deal. And not only has he inked this contract with Gibbs, but his sponsor, Mars Incorporated, which of course operate M&M's, Snickers, Skittles, several other brands that you see rotating on Kyle's car, they've also locked in with Gibbs. So not only does Kyle have the job security for himself, he has something that a lot of drivers want and don't have these days as money and sponsorship are tight, and that is the commitment of a sponsor being alongside him for his future at Joe Gibbs Racing. So Kyle seems dedicated. If you ask me, I think he's certainly going to retire at Joe Gibbs Racing the way things are looking. But it's great for Mars as well to show their commitment to the sport. And given what Kyle's done on the racetrack in recent weeks and in recent years, you can certainly say Mars and all of Kyle's other sponsors as well have gotten sufficient return on their investments. But Kyle, this past weekend at Auto Club, by winning the Cup Series race, he has now reached 200 combined victories among the top three series, the Monster Energy Cup Series, the Xfinity Series, and the Gander Outdoors Truck Series. He has 53 wins in Cup and Trucks and 94 in Xfinity. Now, inevitably, this has brought up comparisons to another certain NASCAR driver who is kind of famous, I would say, for winning 200 races. Of course, I'm talking about Richard Petty. But Richard Petty's, of course, all came in the Cup Series. And, of course, you can make the argument that he had shorter fields in some races. He also had several seasons where there were upwards of 50 or 60 races for him to compete in. Some more races give him the opportunity to win more. So the media, in particular, I think, has made a really big deal about Kyle Busch's 200 wins. And it is an achievement. It's something I do think should be celebrated, and I say that as somebody who isn't a fan of Cup drivers going down to the Xfinity and Truck Series to kind of steal wins away from their regulars, if you will. But there is this sort of begging question that we have here is it fair to compare what Kyle Busch has done in recent years to what Richard Petty did in his prime and in his career? And to me, it depends on how you define the word compare. I think it's fair to compare any two things or any two athletes or any two achievements if all we're doing is looking at their analytics and saying, well, this driver had this level of competition in this series and that level of competition in that series, and here's how many races driver A had to race and to win, here's how many driver B had. If that's all we're doing for the sake of comparing and for the sake of looking at how similar, and I don't think there are a whole lot of similarities here other than it's NASCAR and it's 200, or how different they were, I think that's totally fair. I think you can do that with pretty much any two statistics you come across. But when you start using that to justify and say Kyle Busch is at where Richard Petty was, or he has surpassed even, I've seen some people go this far and say Kyle Busch has surpassed Richard Petty's mark, or he is more impressive with what he's done than what Richard Petty has done. And to me, that's absurd, asinine, insane, disrespectful. Stop me whenever you like. Because the reality is Richard Petty's 200 wins all came in what was either the Grand National Series at the time or the Winston Cup Series, which, of course, is known as the Monster Energy Cup Series today for sponsorship reasons, but it's still the Cup Series. It's what the Cup Series evolved into and became, and Petty was beating guys like David Pearson, Buddy Baker, Cale Yarborough, Bobby Allison, NASCAR Hall of Famers, NASCAR legends, NASCAR drivers who won lots of races themselves. So when you look at some individual races, yeah, Petty had some fields that were only made up of a dozen or a dozen and a half cars, but over his career, he certainly had those other drivers that he had to compete against. So I think it's very dangerous when we start talking about, Kyle Busch's wins in the same breath as Richard Petty's and, using that. I mean, obviously I just said you're allowed to compare them, but to use that to justify putting Kyle ahead of Petty, I think, you certainly risk doing some major disrespect to the king of stock car racing there. I also think it's disrespectful. I've seen some people who are on the very far argument on the other side who have said, Kyle Busch is just going down to Little League to steal wins in the Xfinity and Truck Series. And I feel like that's disrespectful to the Xfinity and Truck Series regulars. You have these drivers who are some of the top prospects in NASCAR, or on the other hand, guys like Matt Crafton, Johnny Sauter, Timothy Peters, Elliott Sadler, Justin Allgaier, veterans who, for whatever reason, didn't really make it at the Cup level, or rides didn't work out, or they didn't pursue that for their careers, but still very good drivers. So to reduce the talent level of those guys to Little League, I think, is also a big mistake. And, I think a more fair comparison would probably be, AAA or AA. I think that's fair, because at the end of the day, we've seen Xfinity in particular become very developmental. So these are young drivers who maybe aren't quite ready for Cup or still have a couple years that they need to take to develop. But it at the end of the day is not the major leagues. It's not the Cup Series. So all things considered, I want to give huge congratulations to Kyle Busch, because I know that this is a record that he's had in mind, that he's wanted to break for many years, that he's been going for many years. And I want to emphasize, I'm not a fan of Cup regulars going down and leeching or bushwhacking or whatever term you want to use, because I do think it takes away from the talent that the other two series have. But there's an old saying, don't hate the player, hate the game. And in this case, I would say don't hate the drivers, don't hate Kyle Busch or Brad Keselowski or Joey Logano or any other driver who's famous for running the maximum amount of races at those certain levels. Blame NASCAR for letting them. Blame NASCAR for allowing Kyle Busch to go out and lead darn near every lap in a minor league race, in an Xfinity Series race. It's not Kyle's fault. Kyle is somebody who loves to race, who loves to compete at every chance he gets. And, I think back to, obviously he has the limitations now, but when I was growing up, I remember there was a race weekend where the Truck Series was in Texas, what was then the Nationwide Series was in Nashville, Tennessee, and the Cup Series was at Pocono, Pennsylvania. And the races were on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, respectively. And Kyle was on a crazy helicopter, private jet schedule, trying to run all three races in three very different locations. And, another thing we have to remember in, giving Kyle Busch his credit here is that these guys are athletes. This isn't like driving your car down the interstate or on the highway or on your local roads. This is professional stock car racing and very physically demanding driving. And so when you add the miles that Kyle's added over the years with all of his Xfinity and Truck Series starts, not to mention all the extra traveling that's gone into doing all those races, it takes a toll on the body. And I think that that's something that, needs to be factored in here and needs to be appreciated, given that Kyle has continued to race at the level that we've seen, winning all these races and competing for championships in the Cup Series, despite running all these extra races every year. So bottom line, I think Kyle's achievement deserves definitely some recognition, maybe not quite as much as what the media, Fox and NBC, have been giving him. It is a great achievement, and I want to give him his credit where it's due. But I also want to be very clear that, this does not give you a free pass to say, okay, Kyle Busch's 200 are just like Petty's 200, or Kyle Busch's 200 are better than Petty's 200. Because at the end of the day, Petty's were all in Cup. And that's something that, say what you will about the shorter fields, maybe the fact that there wasn't quite as much competition or as many competitive cars that's not Petty's fault. Petty was born of a time he was born and raced of a time that he raced. And he went out and beat the best of the best in his day and in his time. So we have to give him that level of respect, I think, for what he was able to accomplish in his career. So I just want to quickly, before we move into some other racing series, give some updates on who's won the races since we've been on the air. Obviously, I mentioned trucks. Their only 2 races have been at Atlanta and Las Vegas. Kyle Busch won both of those. So not too much to say about that. He started the 2019 season with needing 6 total victories to get to 200. So those were 2 that he got in the truck series. In the Xfinity series, Christopher Bell got the win at Atlanta. And he was, of course, probably the best Xfinity Series regular last year. You could argue should have been much closer in the running for a championship than he looked. With all the races that he won and all the dominance that he was showing, making a name for himself, especially when the Cup leeches were gone and weren't allowed to race in the playoffs anymore. Christopher Bell, I think, is going to be a superstar. Yeah, you have to wonder if you're like an Eric Jones or a Denny Hamlin, Gibbs certainly isn't going to want to get rid of him. So when Bell is inevitably able to move up, where is he going to go? So I think that adds a little bit of extra pressure for the drivers at Gibbs right now in the Cup Series. But yeah, I definitely think Bell is going to be a championship contender this year. He's my pick to win the title. But he got the season off to a good start with a win at Atlanta. Kyle Busch, again, here's where he got 2 more of his wins at Las Vegas and Phoenix. And honestly, probably should have won at Auto Club this past weekend as well, but had a mishap in the pits, and it was Cole Custer who ended up grabbing the victory. And Custer was also a Final Four driver last year. He's picking up right where he left off. And I think when you look at Christopher Bell, Cole Custer, and I would say Tyler Reddick, who, of course, won the championship last year, I think they're definitely going to be the 3 to watch. Dare I say it, the big 3 for the Xfinity Series this year. And I'm sure they're going to put on some great battles as the season goes on. But those are your Xfinity Series winners. And in the Cup Series, Brad Keselowski got the win at Atlanta for Team Penske. And Keselowski was actually very sick the day before and the night before the Atlanta race. And he was even quoted as saying that if the Cup race had been on Saturday, he wouldn't have been able to strap in the car and do it. He came down with some sort of stomach virus or food poisoning or something. Certainly was not feeling that well. So hats off to him for sticking it out and getting in the car. They actually had Austin Cindric on standby for Keselowski in case he couldn't go, but clearly he was feeling healthy enough to not just get in the car, but to go out and win the race. So Penske looking very, very strong, and also their other driver, or one of their other drivers, Joey Logano, scoring the win at Las Vegas, I think proves that Penske is certainly, probably along with Gibbs, the best team in NASCAR right now. And not just in NASCAR, but in all the series that Team Penske's competing in right now. Josef Newgarden won the IndyCar race. We'll get to that in a second as well. But Acura Team Penske's looked very strong in IMSA to start the year. And I don't follow V8 Supercars in Australia as much, but I've heard great things about what Penske's doing down there as well. So everywhere around the world that that the Penske Empire is racing in right now, success and a lot of good things to talk about. So that's no exception in the NASCAR Cup Series, as 2 of their 3 drivers have already won races this year. And Kyle Busch, of course, I said, if you've been doing the math, he needed 6 wins. He's got 2 in trucks, 2 in Xfinity. He got his 2 in Cup the last 2 weekends to get to 200, winning at Phoenix and at Auto Club Speedway. So is Kyle Busch a championship favorite? At this point, I think he is. He's off to a great start. I see no signs of him slowing down anytime soon. Gibbs are giving him great cars. He's got a lot of backing with his sponsors and Toyota. I think he's certainly on a high right now, and honestly, he's probably the most talented driver in the sport today. So as long as nothing catastrophic happens this season, he's my pick to win and take it all at Homestead. Of course, he's won at Homestead before when he won his 2015 championship. So it's been a great start to the year for him. And again, I want to emphasize and give my congratulations on the 200, which I know he's been going for a long time. All right, so let's move on to the IndyCar Series now, finally getting their season opener underway at St. Petersburg after a long, long off-season. But as I mentioned, Josef Newgarden winning it for Team Penske, and Penske picking up right where they left off, certainly looking very competitive this season. And I think they've got a chip on their shoulder this year because, of course, Scott Dixon won the title for Ganassi last year, and you had Alexander Rossi up there with Andretti Autosport. So when you drive for Penske, you're expected to win championships. And Newgarden's done it. He did it in 2017. Simon Pagenaud, of course, did it the year before in 2016. and Will Power's a champion, having won in 2014, but none of them were able to break through last year. So there's certainly a lot of pressure on Team Penske's drivers to deliver a championship to the captain, and Josef Newgarden got off the best start he could possibly get off to by winning the season opener. It was also great to see Robert Wickens make an appearance in the paddock last weekend in the IndyCar series, and if you've been following on social media, you'll know that Robert Wickens has made incredible strides in his recovery since that horrifying accident in Pocono 7 months ago. He still can't really walk without a whole lot of assistance. So he is in a wheelchair, but he's certainly made tremendous strides. And I don't know, given what Alex Zanardi did without legs at the Rolex 24 this year, I'm sure there's going to be something out there for Wickens to drive in the not-so-distant future as he continues his recovery. Obviously, the goal is to get back into an IndyCar, and he is still under contract with Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports, so that 6th car is his for the taking when he is able to get back in the car, if he is able to get back in the car. But with the strides that he's made, I have no doubts that he's going to continue to improve and hopefully be able to be back in a car sooner rather than later. Another driver I want to give a shout-out to is Felix Rosenqvist, who replaced Ed Jones in the second Ganassi car this year, the number 10. And ironically, we were just talking about Robert Wickens, but kind of a Wickens-esque debut. A driver who had never raced an IndyCar before, got up front, led a bunch of laps, and ended up finishing 4th. So a great run for him. I've actually seen Felix race in person. I went to the Formula E race in New York City in 2017. And he was racing in Formula E at the time, and I can tell you firsthand, he's a great, talented young driver. And he's kind of followed this trend of drivers who haven't really made it at the European level or had the opportunity to make it, but finances and rides and paths just didn't go their way. They came searching for refuge in America to come over to IndyCar and kind of make a career out of it there. And now we've seen it with Rossi and Wickens and several other drivers. And now Rosenqvist, it seems to be a good landing spot for them. So certainly expecting big things out of Rosenqvist this year, even more so after the great run he had last weekend at St. Petersburg. So a great run for him. Not such a great run for the driver he replaced, Ed Jones, who injured his hand in an accident during the St. Petersburg race, but he has been medically cleared. We actually just got word today that he is going to be able to race at Circuit of the Americas this weekend in the IndyCar Classic. So good news on that front. And also some interesting news coming out this week is that Danica Patrick will return to the Indy 500, not as a driver, but as a broadcaster. NBC Sports has signed her to do some on-air stuff during the month of May, and I've got to say, I think this is a very positive thing for NBC. If you guys aren't aware, Danica actually does have a little bit of media experience. She's done a couple of Xfinity Series broadcasts for Fox Sports. Of course, Fox has been using a lot of active NASCAR drivers in their color commentary for their Xfinity Series races, and Danica's been one of them occasionally, so she has a little bit of experience in the broadcasting front. But even if she just does a passable job, I think this is a great pickup for NBC because she does have a lot of name recognition, and we've seen, I think Dale Jr. has been very successful over at NBC in bringing them some added interest, and of course he's done a great job as a commentator as well. But it's an interesting move for NBC, and one I think is certainly going to pay off at least this year. We'll see if this is just a one-time thing or if Danica kind of makes a second career out of this like so many former athletes do. And speaking of NBC, I just want to talk a little bit about their coverage. Of course, this is the first season that they've had the full IndyCar Series schedule, and also the first year in a while that they've had the St. Petersburg race. Normally, ABC had the season opener over the last few years. And I would say of NBC's coverage, it was good, but it was not great. And it wasn't great because there was a second major flaw in their coverage in as many races. About midway through the race, something happened with the camera feed or something went out. And for about 10 to 15 minutes, we had what was really with some weird audio, too. It sounded almost like a 1960s radio broadcast with a still image of a track that they were using to display on our TV screens. But we heard the commentators who were doing their best to relay the action back to us, but there was about 10 to 15 minutes of essentially dead air from what we saw, at least in terms of what we were seeing on the screen. And this is another major problem that NBC's shown. If you remember last season, they missed the start of a championship race because NASCAR was in Las Vegas the same day, and with the red flag and the race running long, NBC couldn't get the coverage switched over in time, and instead of watching the start of a championship race, we were stuck watching a red flag period at Las Vegas. And I mean, these are problems that NBC, as in their time as broadcasters, haven't really shown. And I think NBC's shown a lot of dedication, so I don't want to be too hard on them. But these are major problems that you certainly don't want to have during the Indy 500. You don't want to have during any race. But it's something that I think they really need to take a look at and do a good job of making sure that they don't have any major issues like this happening again for the rest of the season. But on the whole, Lee Diffie was great as always. Everybody else certainly contributed their part. So good coverage on NBC's part, but certainly need to make sure none of those major mistakes happen again. All right, I'm moving on to Formula One, and the weekend got off to a very sad note. Charlie Whiting, who's been the longtime race director for the FIA in Formula One, passed away suddenly overnight in Australia, just days before the Grand Prix. And he was only 66 years old, and he was doing the track walk and getting ready for the Grand Prix weekend just the day before he passed away, just like he normally would be doing. So his death was very shocking, very unexpected, and really, it was absolutely shocking, to lose him so suddenly. And he was universally liked and respected in the paddock, and just a major hole was left in the FIA with his passing. And Bernie Ecclestone, who was the chairman of F1, the F1 Supremo, a lot of people called him for many, many years, he said that on a personal level for him, Charlie's death hurt him more than any of the drivers that were killed in racing accidents while he was in the sport. And he mentioned that, as tragic as those deaths were, that's the risk that racing drivers sign up for, and that's the risk that they know they're taking as they're strapping into those cars. So as tragic as they are, especially with safety the way it was back then, it was almost something that had to be expected at least once every year or every other year. When the race director, who's left such a presence and an impact on the sport, passes away so suddenly, it really hit hard in the entire community. So certainly our thoughts and prayers are with the Whiting family and the whole Formula One family. No one man can replace Charlie Whiting. And I think literally no one man was able to do everything that Charlie was scheduled to do in Australia. They had to get 3 or 4 guys to step in and fill in all the pieces. So it's going to be challenging to move forward this season without him at the helm. But I do want to get into the race here. So Lewis Hamilton took the pole for Mercedes, and they locked out the front row. So I don't know if Mercedes were just sandbagging during testing. If you remember, Hamilton said Ferrari might be as much as a second or half a second ahead of Mercedes coming out of the Barcelona tests. But we got to Australia, and I don't know if it was because Mercedes were not showing their full potential or just that Ferrari didn't get the setup right this particular weekend, and maybe they'll look stronger in Bahrain in a week and a half. But Mercedes looked very, very strong, and it looked like Hamilton was just going to pick up right where he left off last season and cruise to a win, lead nearly every lap. But it was actually Valtteri Bottas who pretty much dominated the race. He got off to a blistering start, took the lead from Lewis on lap 1, and ended up winning. And he also got the fastest lap, and we'll get to why the fastest lap is more significant than ever in a second now as well. But he got the win, the full 26 points. Lewis coming in second to give Mercedes the full constructors' points, and rounding out the podium was Max Verstappen in his Honda-powered Red Bull. Honda beating both the Ferraris with the Red Bull chassis, and Max Verstappen giving Honda their first podium as a power unit supplier since their return to Formula One in 2015. And on top of that, Carlos Sainz, who's now driving for McLaren, he had an engine failure early in the race. So I think this is proof. I'm sorry to all the McLaren fans out there, but the problems that McLaren have been facing in this V6 turbo era, I think now we have to say definitively with how strong Red Bull looked this weekend, the problems are pretty much solely on McLaren at this point. McLaren don't have any other excuses to fall back on. They've had a year with Renault engines, and you had the comparison right there with Red Bull last year, and McLaren were still stuck in the midfield while Red Bull were one of the big 3 teams that even won a handful of races last season. I think it's down to McLaren to start putting better cars together And I don't think they have an engine excuse to fall back on anymore because we've seen what Honda can do. And Honda looks okay even with Toro Rosso last year. Obviously, Toro Rosso's a midfield team, so it's much harder to judge. But, you know, with Red Bull being able to pick up right where they left off last season with a Honda engine and Verstappen looking very fast and very competitive, I think McLaren's out of excuses at this point. I think you have to go back to the drawing board and start working on the chassis because I think that's where the true problems lie. But the other big news coming into this season is that actually not too long ago, really just a couple of weeks before the season began, it was announced that a World Championship point would be returning for the driver who set the fastest lap. And this isn't unprecedented, although it's been a while. I think the last time this was a rule was 1959. So Formula One's done it before, but not for many, many years. And this is something that I think it's not too gimmicky. I mean, clearly F1 was doing it themselves. We see this in Formula E, and Formula E's got a whole lot of gimmicks, such as fan boost and attack mode, that I think are far worse than giving a driver a point for the fastest lap. But it's something that I think some fans, to a certain extent, have even wanted to see return in Formula One for several years now. And if you ask me personally, it's not something I have a strong opinion over either way. I do think it livened up the end of the Australian Grand Prix, though. I think it would have been a bit of a procession just seeing Bottas cruise home to the win, but now there's a point on offer for fastest lap, and Mercedes are telling Bottas to just bring it home, and the driver ignores his team's orders, and he goes for the fastest lap and ends up getting it, and that's a point. So it does add an extra level of intrigue, interest, and excitement. Whether you think it's an unnatural gimmick or not, I guess is up to you, but I don't know. I personally don't have any major reasons to oppose or support it, but it has divided the fan base a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see how much of an effect it has on the championship. It is 21 more points that are on offer, so we'll see how narrow of a championship fight it is this year, or maybe Mercedes and Lewis just go win a sixth straight championship, and it doesn't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things anyway. So we'll see what happens there. All right, and I think that's going to be it for this week's edition of the Photo Finish. Next week, the Cup Series is in Martinsville, along with the Truck Series after they've had a few weeks off. So we'll discuss that and what happens there on next week's show. And also, IndyCar makes their long-anticipated debut at Circuit of the Americas. And finally, we're going to get to see how a modern-day IndyCar shapes up on the same track as a Formula One car because, of course, Formula One has their U.S. Grand Prix there, so we're going to get a head-to-head comparison of an Indy car and an F1 car for the first time in many, many years. So stay tuned for that. I'm sure that's going to be a good race. But for now, I'm Ben Schneider, and we'll see you in the next episode.